The thundering hooves of 100 cattle shook the ground as 19-year-old Josephine Taylor stood on the rickety porch of her father's struggling ranch. Her eyes narrowed against the dust cloud rising from the parched earth. The year was 1875, and Shoshone City, Idaho, was experiencing one of the worst droughts in its brief history. While other young women her age were attending socials and searching for husbands, Josephine Jo, to those who knew her, was trying desperately to save the only home she'd ever known. "You're wasting your time, Jo," called Martha Willoughby, the town gossip who happened to be passing by the Taylor ranch on her way to deliver a basket of bread to a neighbor. "A woman has no business running cattle. You do better to find yourself a husband before you're completely unmarriageable." Jo didn't bother to respond, though her jaw tightened as she continued to watch the herd. Her father had been bedridden for months now, following a bad fall from his horse, and the responsibility of the ranch had fallen squarely on her shoulders. The neighboring ranchers, all men, had begun circling like vultures, making offers for the land that amounted to robbery. "No one will have you now anyway," Martha continued, seemingly unbothered by Joe's silence. 20 years old next month and still unwed. And look at you. Dressed in those men's clothes, hair all wild from the wind. My herald says you're more cowboy than lady these days." Joe turned then, her blue eyes flashing. "I'd rather be a cowboy than Harold Willoughby's wife any day, Martha. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to run." Martha huffed and continued down the road, no doubt eager to spread more gossip about the Taylor girl's unladylike behavior. Joe sighed and pushed a strand of honey-blonde hair back from her face. She didn't have time to worry about marriage or what the town thought of her. The ranch hands had all left 2 weeks ago when she couldn't pay their wages, and the bank was threatening to foreclose if she didn't make a payment soon. Joe returned to the barn where she'd been mending a broken bridle when Martha's arrival had interrupted her. The leather was worn like everything else on the ranch, but it would have to do. She couldn't afford new tack, not with the drought making feed scarce and expensive. "Josephine," her father's weak voice called from the house. Joe set aside her work and hurried back to the small ranch house. Inside, the air was stale and warm despite the open windows. Her father, once a robust and commanding presence, now lay thin and pale in the bed that had been moved to the front room so he could look out the window. "Did I hear Martha Willoughby's voice?" James Taylor asked, his voice rough from disuse. Joe nodded, pouring a glass of water from the pitcher beside his bed. "Just passing by with her usual helpful comments." Her father's lips twitched in a weak smile. That woman never could keep her thoughts to herself. He took the water gratefully, his hand trembling slightly. "What was it this time? Your unladylike ways, your advanced age of spinsterhood?" "Both," Joe confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "According to Martha, I'm doomed to die alone, surrounded by nothing but cattle and dust." James Taylor's smile faded and concern etched deep lines around his eyes. "Joe, maybe she's right about some things. Not about you being unmarriageable, any man would be lucky to have you, but about the ranch. It's too much for one person, especially now." Joe shook her head firmly. "We're not having this conversation again, Pa. The Taylor ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. I'm not giving up on it just because times are hard. But you're just one woman against nature itself. This drought could last years." "I'll manage," Joe insisted. "The creek on the north pasture still has water. If I can move the cattle there, we might make it until the rains come." Her father sighed, clearly unconvinced. "The north pasture is 10 miles away and you can't drive the herd alone." Joe stood, her decision made. "Then I'll find help. There must be someone passing through town looking for work. I'll go into Shoshone City tomorrow and see what I can find." "With what money, Josephine?" her father asked gently. She touched the gold locket around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she owned, containing a tiny portrait of her mother who had died when Joe was just 12. "I have Mother's locket. It's not much, but it might be enough to hire one good hand for a few weeks. Just long enough to get the herd to water and maybe sell off a few head to make the bank payment." James Taylor's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother would be proud of you, Joe, but she'd also want you to be happy." Joe leaned down and kissed her father's forehead. "I am happy when our ranch is thriving, and it will thrive again. You'll see." The next morning dawned hot and cloudless, the sun already scorching by the time Joe hitched her mare to the small buckboard wagon. She'd put on her only dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, and attempted to tame her wild hair into a respectable bun. The effect was undermined by the cowboy hat she placed firmly on her head, but she couldn't risk a sunburn. Propriety be damned. "I've left stew warming on the stove," she told her father as she checked his water pitcher and medicine. "Mrs. Gunderson will be by at noon to check on you." Their elderly neighbor was the only person in the area who still offered help, and Joe was grateful for her kindness, even if the old woman's hands were nearly as gnarled and weak as her father's now. "Be careful in town," James cautioned. "And Joe, don't feel you have to sacrifice everything for this ranch. Your mother and I wanted it to be a legacy for you, not a burden." Joe squeezed his hand but made no promises. The ranch was her home, her heritage, and her future. She wouldn't give it up without a fight. The 5-mile ride to Shoshone City was dusty and uncomfortable. By the time Joe reached the main street, her dress was coated in a fine layer of dirt, and her carefully arranged hair had already begun to escape its pins. She ignored the stares and whispers that followed her as she tied her horse outside the general store. Inside, the store was blessedly cool compared to the baking heat outside. Joe nodded politely to Mrs. Henderson behind the counter and made her way to the bulletin board where notices were posted, sometimes including advertisements for work. "Well, if it isn't Josephine Taylor," came a silky voice from behind her. "I heard your ranch hands all quit. Seems they didn't take kindly to taking orders from a girl." Joe turned to face Victor Holloway, owner of the largest ranch in the county and the man who'd made the most persistent offers to buy her father's land. "Mr. Holloway," she acknowledged stiffly. "They left because I couldn't pay them, as you well know." The older man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My offer still stands. I'll give you a fair price for the Taylor spread, enough for your father to get proper medical care in boys and for you to set yourself up comfortably." "Your idea of fair and mine differ significantly," Joe replied. "The answer is still no." Victor's smile tightened. "You know you can't run that ranch yourself. You're just prolonging the inevitable. No bank will loan money to a woman, and no cowboy worth his salt will work for one either." Joe lifted her chin. "We'll see about that." She turned back to the bulletin board, but the only notices were for a church social the following Sunday and an advertisement for patent medicine. Her heart sank, though she kept her face carefully neutral. She couldn't let Holloway see her desperation. "Miss Taylor," Mrs. Henderson called from the counter. "Will you be picking up your usual supplies today?" Joe approached the counter, keenly aware of Holloway watching her. "Not today, Mrs. Henderson. I just came to town to see if anyone was looking for work." The older woman's kind eyes filled with sympathy. "I haven't heard of anyone, dear. Times are hard all around with this drought." She lowered her voice. "Though I did hear that the stage brought a stranger to town yesterday, staying at the Elkhorn Saloon, I believe. A cowboy of some sort, by the look of him." Hope flared in Joe's chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." She turned to leave, only to find Victor Holloway blocking her path. "The Elk Horn is no place for a respectable woman, Miss Taylor," he said, his voice carrying just enough for others in the store to hear. "What would people think?" "I imagine they'll think I'm hiring help for my ranch, Mr. Holloway," Joe replied evenly. "Though I'm sure you'll suggest otherwise in your conversations." She stepped around him and walked out into the blinding sunlight, her back straight despite the weight of stairs following her. The Elk Horn Saloon was at the far end of the main street, its swinging doors propped open in a futile attempt to catch any breeze that might pass through town. Joe hesitated outside. She'd never set foot in a saloon before, and doing so would certainly give the gossips like Martha Willoughby enough fodder for weeks. But what choice did she have? The ranch needed help, and if there was a cowboy for hire inside, she had to at least try. Taking a deep breath, Joe pushed through the doors. The saloon was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. When they did, she found herself the center of attention as every head turned in her direction. The piano player faltered mid-note, and the low hum of conversation died. "Well, well," drawled the bartender, a burly man with an impressive mustache. "Don't often see ladies of quality in here, Miss Taylor. Something I can do for you." Joe stepped forward, ignoring the curious stares. "I'm looking for a man," she began, then flushed as several patrons chuckled. "That is, I'm looking to hire a cowhand. I heard there might be someone new in town looking for work." The bartender's eyebrows rose. "Might be. What's the pay?" Joe hesitated. "Room, board, and a share of profits when we sell the cattle." More chuckles, and the bartender shook his head. "Not likely to find many takers for that deal, Miss Taylor. Men need cash money these days." "I can offer a small advance," Joe said, her hand moving unconsciously to the locket around her neck. "How small?" came a deep voice from the corner. Joe turned to see a man rise from a table in the shadows. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard work rather than easy living. As he stepped into the light, she saw he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at the ends where it peeked out from under his worn cowboy hat. "Mr. Joe prompted. "Finch. Ethan Finch," he supplied, approaching with a fluid grace that reminded Joe of a mountain lion she'd once seen stalking through the foothills. "Mr. Finch," she acknowledged. "I can offer $5 advance, with more to come when we sell some cattle." It was a pitiful sum, and they both knew it. $5 wouldn't even buy a decent saddle, let alone compensate a skilled cowhand for the work she needed. Ethan Finch studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That's not much of an incentive, Miss Taylor." "Josephine Taylor of the Taylor Ranch," she replied, squaring her shoulders. "And no, it's not much, but it includes 3 meals a day and a dry place to sleep. The work is hard but honest." The Taylor spread. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I heard that place was on its last legs. Droughts hit it hard from what folks say." Joe felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We've had difficulties, yes, but we have a plan to save the herd. I just need one good hand to help drive the cattle to the north pasture where there's still water." Ethan glanced around the saloon, then back at Joe. The other patrons had resumed their conversations, though many were still watching the exchange with interest. "Let's step outside," Ethan suggested, gesturing toward the door. Joe nodded and led the way back into the harsh sunlight. Once outside, Ethan tilted his hat back slightly to get a better look at her. "Miss Taylor, I've been riding these territories for a few years now, and I've learned to spot a desperate situation when I see one." "Your ranch is in trouble, isn't it?" Joe swallowed hard. "Yes," she admitted. "My father is ill. Our hands have left, and the bank is threatening foreclosure if we don't make a payment soon. But the ranch is good land, Mr. Finch. It's been in my family for generations, and I won't lose it without a fight." Something flickered in Ethan's gray eyes, respect, perhaps, or simple curiosity. "And what makes you think you can save it?" "Because I have to," Joe replied simply. "It's all we have." Ethan studied her for another long moment before speaking. "I'll make you a deal, Miss Taylor. I'll help you move your cattle to water and get them ready for sale. In return, you'll give me that $5 now, meals and lodging as promised, plus 20% of whatever you make from selling the herd." Joe's eyes widened. 20% was a significant share, but if he could help save even half the herd, it would still leave enough to make the bank payment and keep the ranch running a bit longer. 15%, she countered. A smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. 18, and I'll throw in my expertise at negotiating with cattle buyers. You'll get a better price that way. Joe considered this. She'd never sold cattle before. Her father had always handled that part of the business. Having someone who knew the fair market value would be invaluable. "Agreed," she said finally, extending her hand. 18%. Ethan's large hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused. "Deal." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before releasing her hand. "When do we start?" "Immediately," Joe replied. "We've already lost too much time." As they walked toward where Joe had tied her mare, she could feel the weight of stares from townspeople on the street. Martha Willoughby stood outside the millinery, her mouth agape at the sight of Josephine Taylor walking with a strange man she'd clearly just met in a saloon. "Seems we're causing quite a stir," Ethan observed, the hint of amusement in his voice impossible to miss. "Shoshone City thrives on gossip," Joe replied. "By sunset, half the town will be convinced I've hired an outlaw, and the other half will be certain I've found myself a husband." Ethan chuckled, a warm sound that somehow eased some of the tension Joe had been carrying for weeks. "And which would you prefer they think?" Joe glanced at him, surprised by the teasing note in his voice. "Neither, Mr. Finch. I'd prefer they mind their own business and let me save my ranch in peace." "A reasonable but unlikely wish," Ethan said. He untied a sturdy bay gelding from the hitching post outside the saloon. "I'll follow you to the ranch, Miss Taylor. Lead the way." As Joe climbed into her buckboard, she caught sight of Victor Holloway watching from across the street, his expression thunderous. She lifted her chin slightly and nodded in his direction before flicking the reins and setting off toward home, Ethan Finch following close behind on his bay. The sun was high overhead by the time they reached the Taylor ranch. Dust swirled around them as they approached the weathered main house and the cluster of outbuildings that comprised the heart of the operation. The cattle pens were mostly empty, save for a few scrawny calves and their mothers. The main herd, such as it was, could be seen in the distance, scattered across the parched pasture in search of what little grass remained. "How many head do you have left?" Ethan asked as he dismounted. "About 120, Joe replied, climbing down from the buckboard. "Down from nearly 300 this time last year. We lost many in the winter and had to sell others when feed became too expensive." Ethan nodded, his experienced eye taking in the condition of the ranch. "The north pasture is better than this. Much. It's in a valley with a year-round creek running through it. The water level is lower than usual but still flowing. There's good grass there, or at least there was when I checked 2 weeks ago." "Why haven't you moved them already?" Joe sighed. "It's not an easy drive. There's a narrow pass we have to take the herd through, and it takes at least 3 experienced hands to manage it safely. I couldn't do it alone, and by the time I realized how bad the drought would be this year, I couldn't afford to pay the men." Ethan frowned. 2 people still isn't enough for a drive like that. It will have to be, Joe said firmly. Unless you know someone willing to work for the same terms you agreed to. Before Ethan could respond, the front door of the house opened and James Taylor appeared, leaning heavily on a walking stick. His face was pale from the effort of getting out of bed, and Joe hurried to his side. "Pa, you shouldn't be up," she scolded gently, supporting his thin frame. "Had to see who you brought home," James replied, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "Heard the horses." Ethan stepped forward, removing his hat. "Ethan Finch, sir. Your daughter has hired me to help move your cattle to better pasture." James studied the younger man with sharp eyes that belied his weakened physical state. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Finch. That's a Texas drawl if I ever heard one." "Yes, sir. Born and raised near San Antonio. Been working my way north for the past few years. Running from something or towards something?" James asked bluntly. "Pa," Joe exclaimed, embarrassed by her father's directness. Ethan didn't seem offended. "Fair question, sir. Neither exactly. Just looking for the right place to put down roots." James nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Finch, my daughter is a good judge of character, so if she's hired you, that's good enough for me. But I should warn you, this job won't be easy money." "I don't expect it to be," Ethan replied. "But I've never been afraid of hard work." "Good," James said, "because saving this ranch will take more than just hard work. It'll take a miracle." Joe helped her father back inside, settling him in his bed once more. When she returned to the porch, Ethan was still standing where she'd left him, hat in hand, looking out at the struggling ranch. "I'm sorry about my father," Joe said. "He used to be more tactful before his accident. No need to apologize, he's protecting what's his." Ethan turned to face her. "Now, why don't you show me around and we can make a plan for moving those cattle?" For the next hour, Joe gave Ethan a tour of the ranch. She showed him the barn, the bunkhouse where he would stay, the corral, and the equipment they had available, much of it in need of repair. Ethan asked intelligent questions and made mental notes of what needed immediate attention. "The cattle first," he decided as they returned to the main house. "We need to get them to water before we lose any more. Once they're settled in the north pasture, we can come back and work on the most pressing repairs." Joe nodded her agreement. "How soon can we leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Ethan said. "We'll need supplies for at least 3 days on the trail. Do you have enough food stocked?" "Some." "Not much," Joe admitted, "but I can make do with what we have." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Add this to the $5 you're giving me and I'll ride back into town to get what we need: food, ammunition, and a few basic supplies." Joe stared at the money in his hand. "Mr. Finch, I can't take your money." "You're not taking it," he corrected. "You're using it to provision the drive, which benefits us both. Consider it an investment in my 18%. After a moment's hesitation, Joe nodded. "Thank you, I'll pay you back." "I know you will," Ethan said simply. He put his hat back on and headed toward his horse. "I'll be back before sunset. Make a list of what you need most, and I'll do my best to get it all." As Ethan rode away, Joe felt a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. She'd placed her trust and the future of the ranch in the hands of a man she'd just met. It was a risk, but one she had to take. With a deep breath, she turned and went inside to check on her father and make that list. In town, Ethan moved efficiently from store to store, gathering the supplies they would need for the cattle drive. He purchased coffee, beans, flour, bacon, and other staples, as well as ammunition for the rifle he'd seen hanging over the fireplace in the Taylor home. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson watched him curiously. "You're the cowboy working for Josephine Taylor now?" she asked as she wrapped his purchases. "Yes, madam," Ethan replied politely. "Good. That girl needs help, though she'd never admit it." Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice. "Watch out for Victor Holloway. He wants that Taylor land, and he's not used to being told no." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "Thanks for the warning." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Victor Holloway entered the store just as Ethan was gathering his packages. The older man's eyes narrowed as he recognized the stranger from the saloon. "So you took the job with the Taylor girl," Holloway said, blocking Ethan's path to the door. "You should know that ranch is done for. No amount of hard work will save it now." Ethan met Holloway's gaze steadily. "Seems to me that's for Miss Taylor and her father to decide, not you or me." "I'm just trying to save you some trouble, Cowboy. That girl is stubborn as a mule and twice as headstrong. She'll work you to death for promises she can't keep." "I appreciate your concern," Ethan replied, his tone making it clear he didn't. "But I've made my decision." He moved to step around Holloway, but the rancher shifted to block him again. "I could use a good hand at my place," Holloway offered. "Real wages paid weekly. Better than whatever pittance the Taylor girl promised you." Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "I gave Miss Taylor my word, Mr. Holloway. Where I come from, that means something." "Your loss," Holloway sneered, finally stepping aside. "But when you're ready for real work with real pay, my offer stands." Ethan nodded curtly and left the store, securing his purchases to his saddle. As he mounted his horse, he noticed Martha Willoughby watching him from across the street, whispering to another woman. No doubt Josephine Taylor's reputation was already suffering from her association with him. The thought troubled him more than it should have. After all, he was just passing through, looking for work. The Taylor ranch was just another job, albeit one with unusually challenging circumstances. But something about Josephine's determination, her fierce loyalty to her family's legacy, had struck a chord with him. By the time Ethan returned to the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. Jo emerged from the house as he rode up, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd changed back into her practical work clothes, men's trousers, and a loose shirt, and her hair was tied back in a simple braid. "Did you get everything?" she asked as he dismounted. "Most of it," Ethan confirmed, beginning to unload the supplies. "The general store was out of some items, but we have enough to make do." Jo helped him carry the packages inside, where a pot of stew was simmering on the stove, filling the small house with a rich aroma that made Ethan suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd had a home-cooked meal. "That smells good," he commented as they set the supplies on the kitchen table. "It's not much, just rabbit and whatever vegetables I could coax from the garden," Jo replied. "But it's hot and there's plenty. You must be hungry after the ride to town and back." "I could eat," Ethan admitted with a small smile. Jo glanced toward the front room where her father was resting. "Pa's already had his dinner and is sleeping now. We can eat in the kitchen if that's all right with you." "Of course," Ethan said, helping her unpack the supplies while she ladled stew into 2 bowls. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, an oil lamp between them casting a warm glow as the light outside faded. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, both hungry after the long day. "This is good," Ethan said finally, breaking the quiet. "Thank you." Jo smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, making her look younger and less careworn. "You're welcome. It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it. Pa tries, but his appetite isn't what it used to be." "How long has he been ill?" Ethan asked. Jo's smile faded. "He fell from his horse about 6 months ago, broke his leg badly and hit his head. The leg never healed right and he hasn't been the same since the head injury. Some days are better than others." "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." Joe shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but Ethan could see the toll it had taken on her. We manage, or we did, until the drought got so bad. The north pasture will help, Ethan assured her. If the creek is still flowing as you said, we can keep the herd healthy until you can sell some. And if we can't sell enough to make the bank payment? Joe asked, voicing the fear that had clearly been plaguing her. Ethan considered his words carefully. One problem at a time, Miss Taylor. First, we save the cattle, then we figure out how to save the ranch. Joe nodded, seemingly comforted by his practical approach. You're right, and please call me Joe. Miss Taylor makes me feel like my mother. Joe, Ethan agreed with a nod, and I'm Ethan. Mr. Finch makes me feel like my father, and that's not a comparison I welcome. Something in his tone made Joe look at him more closely. Not close to your family. Not anymore, Ethan replied, his expression closing off slightly. Haven't been back to Texas in 5 years, and don't plan to return. Joe didn't press for details, which Ethan appreciated. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and then Joe showed him to the bunkhouse where he would stay. It's not much, she apologized, lighting a lantern inside the simple structure. But the roof doesn't leak and the bunks are sound. I've slept in far worse places, Ethan assured her, setting his saddlebags on one of the lower bunks. This will do just fine. Joe lingered in the doorway, fidgeting slightly with the hem of her shirt. I want to thank you, Ethan, for taking this job when most men wouldn't. It means more than I can say. Ethan turned to face her, struck by the vulnerability that briefly showed through her tough exterior. You don't need to thank me. We made a deal and I'll hold up my end, but… He paused, choosing his words carefully. I admire what you're trying to do here. Not many would fight this hard against such odds. Joe's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. Good night, Ethan. Dawn comes early. Good night, Joe, he replied, watching as she turned and walked back to the main house, her silhouette outlined against the fading light. As promised, they set out at dawn the next day. Joe had packed provisions for 3 days, though Ethan hoped they could make the drive in 2 if all went well. The cattle were thin but still strong enough to make the journey, and they seemed eager to move once Ethan and Joe began herding them northward. Your father was a good rancher, Ethan commented as they rode alongside the moving herd. These cattle are in better shape than I expected, given the circumstances. Joe's face brightened at the praise. He taught me everything I know about ranching. Said a woman should be able to run a spread as well as any man, even if society disagreed. Smart man, Ethan replied. My father, on the other hand, believed women belonged in the house, children at their feet and men making all the decisions. And you, what do you believe? Joe asked, expertly turning a stray cow back toward the main herd. Ethan considered the question. I believe people should do what they're good at, regardless of whether they're men or women. And you, Joe Taylor, are good at this. The drive was hard work, especially with just the 2 of them managing over 100 head of cattle. By midday, both were covered in dust, and their voices were growing hoarse from calling to the herd. When they stopped briefly to water the cattle at a small creek, Joe slid from her horse with a groan. I'd forgotten how much work this is, she admitted, stretching her back. It's been a while since I drove cattle all day. Ethan dismounted more smoothly, though Joe could see he was tired too. We're making good time. If we push on until sunset, we should reach the pass by tomorrow morning. Joe nodded, taking a long drink from her canteen before offering it to Ethan. He accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. Tell me about the pass, he said, handing the canteen back. You mentioned it would be difficult with just the 2 of us. Joe described the narrow ravine. They would need to navigate steep walls on either side and barely wide enough for 3 or 4 cattle abreast. If the animals spooked or tried to turn back, they could easily cause a dangerous pileup. "We'll need to take it slow," Ethan said thoughtfully. "One of us at the front leading them through, the other bringing up the rear to keep them moving forward. It will take hours to get them all through that way," Joe pointed out. "Better slow than dead," Ethan replied grimly. "A stampede in that pass would be devastating." Joe couldn't argue with his logic, though the delay concerned her. Every day away from the ranch meant her father was alone except for Mrs. Gunderson's brief visits. But Ethan was right, they couldn't risk losing the cattle now. They resumed the drive, pushing on until the setting sun made it too dangerous to continue. Finding a relatively flat area with some shelter from the wind, they made camp for the night. The cattle settled nearby, too tired to wander far. Joe built a small fire while Ethan tended to the horses. When he returned, she had coffee brewing and beans heating in a small pot. "Simple fare tonight," she apologized, handing him a tin cup of coffee. "Better than trail rations," Ethan assured her, sitting across the fire. The flickering light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the weariness in his eyes. "How far to the north pasture once we clear the pass?" "About 3 miles," Joe replied. "Mostly easy terrain, sloping downhill into the valley. The creek runs right through the middle and there's good grass on both sides." Ethan nodded, sipping his coffee. "With luck, we'll have them settled there by tomorrow night." They ate their simple meal in comfortable silence, both too tired for much conversation. As the fire burned low, Joe wrapped herself in her blanket and lay down, using her saddle as a pillow. Across the fire, Ethan did the same. "Good night, Ethan," Joe murmured, her eyes already closing. "Good night, Joe," came his soft reply. "Sleep well." Despite her exhaustion, Joe found herself lying awake, listening to the night sounds around them, the occasional lowing of the cattle, the soft nickering of the horses, and the steady breathing of the man across the fire. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of security she hadn't felt since her father's accident. Eventually, sleep claimed her, and when she woke, the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east. Ethan was already up, rekindling the fire and setting coffee to brew. "You should have woken me," Joe said, sitting up and pushing her hair back from her face. Ethan glanced over at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You looked like you needed the rest." They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and jerky, then broke camp and got the herd moving again. By mid-morning, they reached the pass. It was just as Joe had described, a narrow gap between towering rock walls, barely wide enough for 3 cattle side by side. "I'll take the lead," Ethan said, studying the terrain. "You follow behind and keep them moving. If any try to turn back, make noise, lots of it. We don't want them getting the idea they can retreat." Joe nodded, understanding the strategy. Ethan rode ahead with a few of the lead cows, guiding them into the pass. Once they started through, Joe began urging the rest of the herd to follow. It was slow, painstaking work, especially when they reached the narrowest part of the ravine. The cattle grew nervous, sensing the danger of the tight space, and Joe had to work hard to keep them moving forward. Hours passed, the sun climbing high overhead and then beginning its descent. Joe's throat was raw from calling to the cattle, and her arms ached from waving her hat to keep the animals moving. Finally, as the light began to fade, the last cow cleared the pass, and Joe let out a sigh of relief. She rode forward to where Ethan was waiting with the bulk of the herd in a small valley beyond the pass. His shirt was dark with sweat, his face streaked with dust, but his eyes were bright with accomplishment. "We did it," Joe said, her own fatigue momentarily forgotten in the triumph of the moment. "We did," Ethan agreed. "And just in time. Another hour and it would have been too dark to see. They made camp there for the night, both too exhausted to push on to the north pasture. The cattle were tired as well, settling quickly once they were free of the confining pass. This time, when Joe lay down by the fire, sleep came swiftly. She dreamed of green pastures and flowing water, of cattle growing fat and healthy, of her father strong again and the ranch prospering. And somewhere in those dreams, Ethan Finch was there too, his steady presence a comfort she hadn't known she needed. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the heat of the previous days. They reached the north pasture by noon, and Joe felt her heart lift at the sight that greeted them. The creek still flowed, its clear water glistening in the sunlight, and the grass, while not as lush as in better years, was still green and plentiful. The cattle seemed to sense the bounty ahead, quickening their pace as they approached. "It's perfect," Ethan said, watching as the herd spread out along the creek, drinking deeply before beginning to graze. "It is," Joe agreed, relief washing over her. "They should do well here until we're ready to sell." They spent the remainder of the day setting up a simple camp. They would stay for a few days to ensure the cattle settled properly and to select the ones that would be sold first. Ethan constructed a rough shelter using branches and Joe's tarp, creating a space that would protect them from the elements if the weather turned. As evening approached, Joe found herself reluctant to return to the ranch just yet. Here, in this green valley with the cattle safe and Ethan's company, the weight of her worries seemed lighter. Back at the ranch, reality awaited her father's illness, the looming bank payment, the repairs that couldn't be delayed much longer. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan said, coming to sit beside her on a fallen log as the sun began to set. Joe smiled wryly. "I'm not sure they're worth that much." "Try me," he encouraged. Joe sighed, looking out over the peaceful scene before them. "I was just thinking that I don't want to go back yet. Is that terrible? My father is alone, the ranch is falling apart, and yet part of me wants to stay here where things seem possible." Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "It's not terrible, it's human. Sometimes we all need a moment to breathe before facing our battles again." "And what about you?" Joe asked, turning to look at him. "What battles are you avoiding by being here?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, Joe thought he might not answer, but then he spoke, his voice low. "My father wanted me to marry the daughter of a neighboring rancher. A suitable match, he called it. I had other ideas. We argued, things were said that couldn't be unsaid, and I left. Been drifting ever since, taking work where I can find it." "Do you regret it?" Joe asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "No, the life he wanted for me wasn't the one I wanted for myself. I just haven't quite figured out what I do want yet." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. The only sounds the gentle lowing of the cattle and the soft gurgle of the creek. Eventually, they retired to their separate bedrolls beneath the shelter. But Joe lay awake for a long time, thinking about choices and regrets, and the unexpected understanding she'd found in a drifting cowboy from Texas. The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. They rose with the sun, checked the cattle, repaired what they could of their makeshift camp, and spent the afternoon selecting the animals that would fetch the best price at market. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sharing stories of their lives and dreams. Joe learned that Ethan had grown up on a prosperous ranch near San Antonio, the only son among 3 daughters. His father had groomed him from boyhood to take over the family business, never considering that Ethan might want something different. "What did you want?" Joe asked one evening as they shared the last of a rabbit Ethan had managed to shoot that morning. Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "To see more of the world than just Texas." To make my own way, build something of my own rather than inheriting my father's life. And have you seen the world, I mean? Parts of it, Ethan replied with a small smile. More than I would have if I'd stayed. I worked cattle drives up to Kansas, spent a winter in Colorado, rode with a hunting party in Wyoming. He glanced at her. What about you? Did you ever want something beyond the ranch? Joe considered the question. No one had ever asked her that before. It had always been assumed she would marry someday and leave the ranch to her husband's care. I love the ranch, she said slowly. It's my home, my heritage. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see San Francisco or Chicago or even New York City. To wear a fine dress and attend a real theater performance or ride in a train across the country. She laughed softly. Silly dreams for a rancher's daughter. Not silly, Ethan corrected. Dreams keep us going when times are hard. On the fourth day, they agreed it was time to return to the ranch. The cattle were settling well, and they needed to begin preparations for taking some to market. They left early, riding hard to make it back before nightfall. As they approached the Taylor ranch, Joe felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief to be home, to check on her father, but apprehension about what challenges awaited. To her surprise, there was a buggy outside the house, one she recognized as belonging to Dr. Green from Shoshone City. Something's wrong, she said, spurring her horse forward. They galloped the remaining distance to the house, dismounting quickly and rushing inside. Dr. Green was just emerging from the front room, his medical bag in hand and a grave expression on his face. "Doctor," Joe said, her heart racing. "My father, he's stable now," Dr. Green assured her quickly. "Mrs. Gunderson sent for me when his fever spiked yesterday. Pneumonia, I'm afraid. I've given him medicine to help, but at his age and in his weakened condition." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Joe knew what pneumonia could do to someone as frail as her father. "How long has he been ill?" she asked, moving toward the front room. "Mrs. Gunderson says the fever started the day after you left," the doctor replied. "She's been with him as much as possible, but she had to return home at night." Joe felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She'd been enjoying her time at the North Pasture while her father had been fighting for his life. "Thank you for coming, doctor," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What can I do for him, doctor?" Green gave her instructions for managing the fever and ensuring James took the medicine he'd left. As the doctor prepared to leave, he paused, looking from Joe to Ethan, who had remained quietly in the background. "Miss Taylor, I know this is difficult timing, but Mr. Holloway asked me to remind you that the bank payment is due in 10 days. He mentioned something about being willing to make arrangements if you've reconsidered his offer for the ranch." Joe's jaw tightened. "I'm sure he did." "Please tell Mr. Holloway that I haven't forgotten the payment, and I haven't changed my mind about selling." After the doctor left, Joe went to her father's bedside. James was sleeping fitfully, his breathing labored and his face flushed with fever. She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her heart aching at how much more frail he seemed after just a few days. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression somber. "What can I do?" Joe looked up at him gratefully. "Would you mind taking care of the horses? I need to stay with him." "Of course," Ethan agreed. "And I'll see about getting some food prepared. You need to keep your strength up too." As Ethan turned to leave, Joe called after him. "Ethan, thank you for everything." He nodded once, his eyes conveying understanding that went beyond words. For the next 2 days, Joe rarely left her father's side. The fever raged, breaking only briefly before returning with greater intensity. Ethan took over the ranch chores, bringing meals to Joe and sitting with James when she needed to rest. On the third night, as a storm gathered outside, James's fever broke for good. His breathing eased and he opened his eyes, recognizing Joe for the first time since their return. "You're back," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Yes, Pa," Joe said, tears of relief filling her eyes. "We got the cattle to the north pasture. They're safe now." James managed a small smile. "Good girl. Always knew you could do it." He drifted back to sleep, but this time it was the peaceful rest of healing rather than the restless sleep of fever. Joe finally allowed herself to step outside for a breath of fresh air. She found Ethan on the porch, watching the lightning flash across the distant hills. "His fever broke," she told him, exhaustion evident in her voice. "The doctor was right, he's too stubborn to give up." "Like daughter, like father," Ethan observed with a gentle smile. Joe leaned against the porch railing, suddenly too tired to stand. Ethan moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist. "You need rest," he said firmly. "You've barely slept in days." "The bank payment," Joe protested weakly. "We need to get the cattle to market, only 7 days left." "I'll handle it," Ethan promised. "You sleep. Trust me, Joe." And in that moment she realized she did trust him completely and without reservation. It was a startling realization, but she was too exhausted to examine it closely. "All right," she agreed, allowing him to help her to her room. At the doorway, he paused, his hand lingering on her arm. "Sleep as long as you need to. I'll be here when you wake up." The simple promise meant more to Joe than any grand declaration could have. She nodded, too tired for words, and closed the door behind her. Within minutes, she was asleep, the sound of rain on the roof a soothing lullaby. When Joe awoke, sunlight was streaming through her window. She sat up with a start, realizing she'd slept the entire day and night. Quickly dressing, she hurried out to find her father. James was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better. Color had returned to his cheeks, and though he was still weak, his eyes were clear and alert. "Good morning, sleeping beauty," he teased as Joe entered the room. "Your young man said not to wake you until you were ready." "He's not my young man," Joe protested automatically, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. James raised an eyebrow but didn't contradict her. "He's been taking good care of things while you rested. Said something about riding to town this morning to talk to cattle buyers." Joe's eyes widened. "He went to town. Alone. Seemed confident he could handle it," James replied. "Said he'd been negotiating cattle prices since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." Joe wasn't sure whether to be grateful or concerned. On one hand, they desperately needed to sell some cattle to make the bank payment. On the other, Ethan was walking into Victor Holloway's territory without her there to run interference. She spent the morning caring for her father and catching up on household chores. By mid-afternoon, she was watching anxiously for Ethan's return. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she rushed to the porch, relief washing over her at the sight of Ethan riding toward the house. "How did it go?" she called as he dismounted. Ethan's face was grim as he climbed the porch steps. "Holloway's been busy. He's spread word all over town that the Taylor ranch is failing and that any cattle you sell are likely diseased or starving." Joe felt her heart sink. "No reputable buyer will touch our cattle with that kind of talk going around." "That's what Holloway's counting on," Ethan confirmed. "He wants you desperate enough to accept his lowball offer for the ranch." "What are we going to do?" Joe asked, fighting to keep the despair from her voice. "The payment is due in less than a week now." Ethan's expression shifted, a determined gleam appearing in his eyes. "We're going to outfox him. There's a buyer from Boys in Shoshone City looking for stock. New to the area, doesn't know Holloway yet. I spoke to him at the hotel." "And?" Joe prompted when he paused. "And he's interested, very interested. But he wants to see the cattle himself before making an offer." Hope flickered to life in Joe's chest. "When?" "Tomorrow, if we can get him to the north pasture," Ethan said. "I told him our best stock was there, and he's willing to make the ride if the cattle are as good as I described." "You're brilliant," Joe exclaimed, impulsively throwing her arms around him in a quick embrace. Ethan seemed surprised by the gesture but didn't pull away. Instead, his arms came around her briefly before they both stepped back, a flush coloring Joe's cheeks. "I should check on Pa," she said, suddenly flustered. "Will you come in for supper soon?" "I'll just see to my horse first," Ethan replied, his voice a touch rougher than usual. That night, over a simple meal of cornbread and stew, they made plans for the following day. Ethan would ride to town at dawn to escort the buyer to the north pasture. Joe would stay with her father, whose improved condition still didn't allow for him to be left alone for long periods. "I should be there for the sale," Joe argued. "It's my ranch, my cattle." "Your father needs you more right now," Ethan countered gently. "And trust me, Joe, I'll get you a fair price. Better than fair." James, who had been listening from his bed in the front room, called out, "Let the man do what he does best, Josephine. From what I've seen, he's a shrewd negotiator." Joe sighed, recognizing the wisdom in their words even as she chafed at not being present for such an important transaction. "All right, but I want to know everything: how many head, what price, all of it." "Full accounting," Ethan promised with a small smile. "I wouldn't dare come back without one." The next morning, Joe stood on the porch watching Ethan ride away in the pre-dawn light. Something had shifted between them in the days since their return from the north pasture, a warmth, a connection that went beyond their business arrangement. She found herself thinking of him at odd moments, wondering about his life before Shoshone City, and, more dangerously, imagining what it might be like if he stayed. Such thoughts were foolish, Joe told herself firmly as she went back inside to check on her father. Ethan Finch was a drifter by his own admission. Once the cattle were sold and the immediate crisis averted, he would collect his percentage and move on. That was their arrangement, and she had no right to expect anything more. The day stretched endlessly as Joe waited for Ethan's return. She kept herself busy with chores, trying not to watch the sun's slow progress across the sky. Her father noticed her restlessness, but mercifully refrained from commenting on it. It was nearly sunset when Joe heard riders approaching. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the golden light of the setting sun. Ethan was returning, and he wasn't alone. Beside him rode a well-dressed man who could only be the cattle buyer from Boise. What surprised Joe was the third rider, Victor Holloway himself, his expression thunderous. "What's happening?" James called from inside, sensing Joe's sudden tension. "It's Ethan with the buyer," she replied, "and Victor Holloway." Before James could respond, the three men reached the house. Ethan dismounted first, a barely contained smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Taylor," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed a different message entirely. "May I present Mr. Harold Jenkins, cattle buyer for the Boise Valley Company?" The well-dressed man tipped his hat to Joe. "Miss Taylor, a pleasure. Your man Finch here has been singing your praises all day." Joe felt her cheeks warm at the phrase "your man," but she maintained her composure. "Welcome to the Taylor Ranch, Mr. Jenkins. I hope you found our cattle to your satisfaction." "Indeed I did," Jenkins replied enthusiastically. "Fine stock, especially considering the drought conditions. We've reached an agreement for 30 head at $12 each." Joe's eyes widened in surprise. $12 a head was well above the going rate, especially for cattle that were still recovering from poor grazing conditions. "That's very generous, Mr. Jenkins," she said carefully, aware of Holloway's glowering presence. "Fair market value for quality stock," Jenkins insisted. My company is expanding operations and needs good breeding cattle. Yours fit the bill perfectly." Holloway finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Jenkins, I've warned you about the condition of that herd. You're making a mistake." "I saw the cattle with my own eyes, Holloway," Jenkins replied calmly. "They're exactly what I need. The deal is done." He turned back to Joe, removing an envelope from his coat pocket. $360, Miss Taylor, as agreed with Mr. Finch. The men will come tomorrow to drive the selected cattle to the railhead. Joe accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. It was more than enough to make the bank payment and have some left over for supplies and repairs. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she said sincerely. "Your business is greatly appreciated." Jenkins nodded, clearly pleased with the transaction. "Well, I should be getting back to town. Got a telegram to send to boys about our new acquisition." He tipped his hat once more to Joe, nodded to Ethan, and deliberately ignored Holloway as he mounted his horse and rode away. Holloway remained, his face darkening with anger as he looked from Joe to Ethan. "You'll regret crossing me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Both of you. The only regrettable thing here is your attempt to sabotage an honest business transaction," Ethan replied evenly. "Miss Taylor's cattle are healthy and fairly priced. Your lies didn't work this time." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "This time," he repeated, "but there's always next time, isn't there? That bank payment buys you a reprieve, Miss Taylor, not salvation. This drought isn't ending anytime soon, and you're still a woman trying to run a man's business." Joe straightened her spine, meeting Holloway's gaze directly. "This woman just outsmarted you, Mr. Holloway. I'd keep that in mind before you make any more predictions about my future." For a moment, Holloway looked as though he might say something more, but instead, he yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, dust billowing in his wake. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Joe turned to Ethan, her eyes bright with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. $12 a head. How did you manage that?" Ethan's smile finally broke free, transforming his face. "Jenkins is new to the area but not to the cattle business. He recognized good stock when he saw it, and he's not intimidated by Holloway like the local buyers." "But that's still above market price," Joe pressed. "I may have mentioned that another buyer was interested," Ethan admitted with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Created a bit of competitive spirit." Joe laughed, the sound pure and joyful, releasing weeks of tension. "You really are a shrewd negotiator. I told you I'd get a fair price," Ethan reminded her, his own expression softening as he watched her happiness. "Fair? It's miraculous," Joe exclaimed, clutching the envelope of money. "This will cover the bank payment with enough left over for feed and some repairs." "And my 18%, Ethan added with a wink. "Worth every penny," Joe assured him, her smile fading slightly as she remembered their arrangement. Now that the immediate crisis was averted, would he be leaving? The thought brought an unexpected ache to her heart. Before she could dwell on it further, James called from inside. "Are you two going to stand out there all evening, or is someone going to tell me what happened?" They shared a laugh and went inside to share the good news with her father. James listened with growing amazement as Ethan recounted the day's events, including Holloway's failed attempt to dissuade the buyer. "That was well done, son," James said when Ethan finished, the endearment slipping out naturally. "Very well done indeed." Joe saw a flicker of emotion cross Ethan's face at her father's words, pleasure, perhaps, or a deeper feeling she couldn't quite name. It struck her that, for all his competence and confidence, Ethan Finch might be just as hungry for belonging as she was for security. The next morning, Joe counted out Ethan's share of the cattle sale, $64.80. a substantial sum for a few weeks' work. She placed the money in an envelope and found him in the barn, repairing a broken stall door. "Your percentage," she said, holding out the envelope. As promised, Ethan wiped his hands on a rag before accepting it. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. Joe wanted to ask if he was leaving now, but the words stuck in her throat. Ethan seemed equally at a loss, examining the envelope without opening it. "I was thinking," Joe finally began. "The barn roof still needs fixing, and the corral on the west side is falling apart. If you'd be interested in staying a bit longer, I could use the help. I can't pay much, but—" "Yes," Ethan interrupted, his answer coming quickly. "I mean, I'd be happy to stay and help with repairs. No need to decide about payment right away." Relief washed over Joe, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun streaming through the barn doors. "Good. That's good." Their eyes met and held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat and turned back to the stall door. "I should finish this before Jenkins's men arrive for the cattle," he said. "Of course," Joe agreed, backing toward the barn door. I'll go see about breakfast." As she walked back to the house, Joe couldn't suppress a smile. Ethan was staying, at least for now. It wasn't a declaration or a promise of forever, but it was a beginning. And for today, that was enough. Over the next 2 weeks, life at the Taylor Ranch settled into a new routine. Joe made the bank payment, silencing Holloway's threats for the time being. Ethan worked tirelessly on repairs, his skilled hands bringing new life to the weathered buildings. James continued to recover, gradually regaining his strength until he could sit on the porch for a few hours each day, offering advice and encouragement. Together, they began to plan for the future, not just surviving the drought, but thriving despite it. Ethan suggested digging a new well closer to the house and constructing a windmill to help with irrigation. Joe mapped out a smaller vegetable garden that could be more efficiently watered. James contributed ideas for breeding the remaining cattle to produce hardier calves better suited to the harsh conditions. It was during one such planning session, as they sat around the kitchen table one evening, that Mrs. Gunderson arrived with news from town. "Martha Willoughby's been busy with her gossip again," the elderly woman announced without preamble, settling her ample frame into a chair Joe hastily pulled out for her. "Says you two are living in sin out here, and that's why you haven't been to town for the Sunday service these past weeks." Joe felt her face flame with embarrassment. "That's ridiculous. Ethan stays in the bunkhouse, and besides, Pa is here." "Since when has truth ever stopped Martha's wagging tongue?" Mrs. Gunderson replied with a snort. "She's just sour because her precious Harold has been making eyes at the new schoolteacher." James chuckled from his place at the head of the table. "Martha always did enjoy stirring up trouble. Remember when she spread that rumor about the Methodist minister and the widow Johnson?" "As if I could forget," Mrs. Gunderson said, rolling her eyes. "Poor Reverend Phillips couldn't show his face for weeks without blushing." Ethan remained quiet during this exchange, but Joe noticed a troubled expression cross his face. Later, after Mrs. Gunderson had gone home with a basket of fresh eggs as thanks for her visit, Ethan found Joe on the porch watching the stars come out. "I should move on," he said without preamble. Joe turned to him in surprise. "What? Why?" "The gossip in town," Ethan explained. "It's not fair to you or your father. Your reputation, my reputation, has been the subject of gossip since I started wearing trousers and running this ranch," Joe interrupted. "I don't care what Martha Willoughby or anyone else thinks." "You should care," Ethan insisted. "A woman's reputation is important in these parts. I've seen how it can affect business, relationships, everything." Joe stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face in the fading light. "Are you really worried about my reputation, Ethan? Or is this just an excuse to leave because you're getting too comfortable here?" Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair, Joe. Isn't it?" she challenged. "You've been running for 5 years by your own admission. Maybe it's time to stop and figure out what you really want." "And what about you?" Ethan countered, turning back to face her. "Do you know what you want? Because from where I'm standing, you're so focused on saving this ranch that you've never considered what might make you happy beyond it." The words struck home, leaving Joe momentarily speechless. Was he right? Had she been so consumed with preserving her family's legacy that she'd never truly considered her own desires? Before she could formulate a response, they heard James calling from inside. The moment broken, they went in to see what he needed, the conversation left unfinished between them. The next day, an uneasy tension hung in the air as they went about their chores. Joe found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, trying to decipher his thoughts. Was he making plans to leave? The idea brought a sharp pain she wasn't prepared for. By mid-afternoon, Joe couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. She found Ethan by the corral, mending a section of fence. "I know what I want," she said without preamble. Ethan looked up, clearly startled by her sudden appearance and declaration. "What? Last night you asked if I know what I want," Joe reminded him. "I do. I want this ranch to succeed. I want my father to recover his health. And I want you to stay, not just to help with repairs or the cattle, but because—" She faltered, gathering her courage. "Because you make me happy, Ethan Finch. Happier than I've been in a very long time." Ethan set down his tools, his expression softening as he took a step toward her. "Joe, you don't have to say anything right now," she hurried on. "I just wanted you to know. Whatever you decide, whether to stay or go, I wanted you to know that." She turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest, but Ethan caught her arm, gently turning her back to face him. "I've been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place," he admitted, his voice low and vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. "But when I'm with you, Joe, I find myself wanting to learn." Hope bloomed in Joe's chest. "You do?" Ethan nodded, his hand still on her arm, his touch warm through the fabric of her shirt. "I do. I just don't know if I have the right to ask you to take a chance on a drifter with nothing to his name but a horse and saddle." "You have more than that," Joe corrected softly. "You have courage, intelligence, kindness. You have a way of making me believe that anything is possible, even saving a struggling ranch in the worst drought in memory." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, transforming it in a way that made Joe's heart skip. "Is that so?" "It is," she confirmed, returning his smile. "And I'm not asking for promises, Ethan. Just stay a little longer, see where this leads." "I think I'd like that," Ethan said, his hand sliding down to capture hers. "Very much." The moment hung between them, full of possibility and unspoken feelings. Then, with a gentle tug, Ethan drew her closer. Joe went willingly, her free hand rising to rest against his chest as he bent his head toward hers. Their first kiss was tentative, a soft brush of lips that quickly deepened into something more certain. Joe felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, leaving her unbalanced but wonderfully, gloriously alive. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Still think you know what you want," he murmured, a smile in his voice. "More than ever," Joe replied without hesitation. From the direction of the house came the sound of James Taylor clearing his throat rather loudly. They stepped apart to see him standing on the porch, leaning on his cane but looking decidedly amused. "Don't stop on my account," he called with a grin. "Just thought you might want to know Martha Willifby's buggy just turned onto our road. Might want to look a bit less. engaged when she arrives. Joe groaned, but couldn't suppress a laugh. Perfect timing as always, Martha. Ethan squeezed her hand once before releasing it. To be continued, he promised, his eyes conveying much more than his words. Martha Willoughby's visit was predictably filled with thinly veiled criticisms and probing questions. She examined the improvements to the ranch with surprised approval, her eyebrows rising notably when she observed Ethan's skilled carpentry on the new porch steps. "You seem to have found quite the handyman, Josephine," Martha commented, her tone suggesting she believed his talents extended beyond repair work. "Will he be staying on permanently?" "Mr. Finch and I have a business arrangement," Joe replied evenly. "He's helping restore the ranch in exchange for room, board, and a percentage of profits." "Business arrangement," Martha repeated skeptically. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" James, who had been relatively quiet during Martha's visit, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Willoughby, I may be recovering from illness, but I assure you my hearing and my wits are intact. If you've come here to insult my daughter and our guest under the guise of a social call, perhaps it's time you took your leave." Martha flushed, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly. "I meant no offense, James. I'm simply concerned for Josephine's reputation. A young, unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. Mr. Finch stays in the bunkhouse," James interrupted firmly. "And I'm here as chaperone. Josephine's reputation is perfectly intact. Thank you for your concern." The dismissal was clear. Martha sniffed indignantly but rose to leave, unable to argue further without appearing even more rude. As Joe saw her to her buggy, the older woman paused for a parting shot. "You know, Josephine, despite what people say, you might actually make someone a suitable wife someday, if you just try to be a bit more conventional." Joe couldn't help the laugh that escaped her. "Mrs. Willoughby, I believe that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." "Thank you for the visit." Martha huffed and climbed into her buggy, clearly unsure whether she'd been complimented or insulted. As the dust from her departing vehicle settled, Joe returned to the porch where Ethan and her father waited. "Well, that should keep the gossip mill busy for at least a week," James observed dryly. "Longer, I imagine," Joe replied, settling into a chair beside him. "She seemed particularly interested in our business arrangement." Ethan leaned against the porch railing, an amused glint in his eyes. "Should we give her something more substantial to talk about?" James chuckled. "I'm not sure my old heart could take the excitement." They laughed together, the moment light and easy despite Martha's visit. Yet as the day wore on, Joe found herself thinking about the older woman's parting words. Despite the insulting delivery, there was a kernel of truth in them. Joe had never seriously considered marriage, too focused on the ranch and then on her father's illness. But now, with Ethan in her life, she found herself wondering about possibilities she'd previously dismissed. That evening, after her father had retired for the night, Joe found Ethan on the porch, gazing up at the stars. She joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, echoing his words from days earlier. Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I was thinking about roots," he admitted. "About how a man who's never stayed anywhere more than a few months might go about putting some down." Joe's heart quickened. "And have you reached any conclusions?" "A few," Ethan replied, turning to face her. "First, that roots need good soil to flourish. Second, that they grow stronger when nurtured. And third," he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek, "that I've never wanted to plant them anywhere until now." Joe leaned into his touch, her eyes holding his. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Ethan Finch?" "I'm saying I love you, Josephine Taylor," Ethan said simply. I love your strength, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you fight for what matters to you. And if you'll have me, I'd like to stay and build a life here with you." Joy bubbled up within Joe, so intense it almost hurt. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, I'll have you. 1,000 times yes." Ethan's arms encircled her, drawing her close as their lips met in a kiss that sealed their declaration. When they parted, both were smiling, the future suddenly bright with promise. "Martha Willoughby is going to be insufferable when she hears about this," Joe murmured against Ethan's shoulder. "Let her," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Joe's head. "Some things are worth a little gossip." They stood together under the vast Idaho sky, two hearts that had found their way to each other against all odds. The ranch might still face challenges: drought, harsh winters, economic uncertainties, but they would face them together, stronger as a pair than either had been alone. The next morning, Joe woke with a lightness in her heart that had been absent for too long. She dressed quickly and went to check on her father, finding him already awake and looking better than he had in months. "Good morning, Pa," she greeted him cheerfully. "You're looking well today." James smiled knowingly. Amazing what a little happiness in the house can do for a man's recovery. "I take it you and Ethan reached an understanding last night." Joe felt her cheeks warm. "We did. He's asked to stay permanently, with me, with us." "About time," James replied with satisfaction. "I was beginning to think I'd have to drop some more obvious hints." Joe laughed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "You knew. I may be old and sick, but I'm not blind," her father said affectionately. "I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching, and the way you light up when he enters a room." His expression grew more serious. "He's a good man, Joe. Reminds me of myself at that age, a bit unsure of his place in the world, but with a good heart and strong hands." "I love him, Pa," Joe said simply. James nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "I know you do, and he loves you enough to put down roots after years of drifting. That says something important about a man." They heard the front door open and close, followed by Ethan's footsteps in the kitchen. Joe's heart quickened at the mere sound of his presence in their home. "Go on," James encouraged with a smile. "Don't keep him waiting on my account." "I'll be up for breakfast shortly." Joe kissed her father's cheek and went to find Ethan, who was stoking the kitchen stove to life. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a smile that made her heart flutter. "Good morning," he said, straightening to his full height. "I thought I'd get the coffee started." "Good morning," Joe replied, closing the distance between them to plant a quick kiss on his lips. "Pa knows, by the way, about us." Ethan chuckled, his arms coming around her waist. "I suspected he might. He's an observant man." "He approves," Joe added, resting her hands on Ethan's chest. "Very much." "That's a relief," Ethan said, though he didn't look particularly surprised. "I was planning to speak with him today to formally ask his blessing." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Were you now?" "And what exactly were you planning to ask his blessing for?" Ethan's expression grew more serious, though his eyes remained warm. "For his daughter's hand in marriage, if she'll have me." "I know it's fast, Joe, but when you know something's right—" "Yes." Joe interrupted, her heart so full she could barely contain it. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ethan Finch." His answering smile was radiant as he lifted her off her feet in a joyful embrace, spinning them both around the small kitchen. Their laughter mingled, filling the once solemn house with the sound of happiness. When he set her down, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. "I've been carrying this for years," he explained, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center. "It was my grandmother's. She gave it to me before she died, said I should save it for when I found the woman I wanted to spend my life with. I've been waiting for the right moment to give it to you." Joe's eyes filled with tears as Ethan took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring how the pearl caught the morning light. "Like its new owner," Ethan replied softly. From the doorway came the sound of James clearing his throat. "I believe this is the part where I'm supposed to act surprised and possibly outraged that a young man is proposing to my daughter without speaking to me first." They turned to find him leaning on his cane, his eyes twinkling with amusement despite his stern expression. "Sir, I was planning to ask your permission formally," Ethan began, but James waved him off. "And I was planning to give it," the older man replied with a grin. "Though I would have enjoyed making you squirm a bit first. Now, is there coffee to go with this celebration, or are we expected to toast your engagement with well water?" The three of them shared a hearty laugh as Joe hurried to finish preparing breakfast. As they ate together, they began to make plans not just for a wedding, but for the future of the ranch and their life together. "We should marry soon," Ethan suggested, "before the winter sets in. That way we can face the cold season together properly. Eager, aren't you?" James teased, though his smile was approving. Ethan didn't deny it. "When you've spent years wandering, sir, and finally find where you belong, there's no sense in delaying happiness." Joe squeezed his hand across the table. 2 weeks, she proposed. "That will give us time to prepare and for word to spread so people can attend if they wish." 2 weeks it is, Ethan agreed. "Though I doubt Martha Willoughby will need that long to inform the entire county." True to their prediction, news of the engagement spread through Shoshone City like wildfire. By the time Joe and Ethan rode into town 3 days later to make arrangements with the minister, it seemed everyone knew of their plans. "Josephine Taylor," called Martha Willoughby from the steps of the general store. "Is it true? Are you really marrying this cowboy you've known for barely a month?" Joe exchanged an amused glance with Ethan before replying. "Yes, Mrs. Willoughby. Mr. Finch and I are to be married in 11 days' time. You're welcome to attend the ceremony if you wish." Martha's expression was a comical mixture of shock and vindication. "Well, I must say I never thought I'd see the day. You, of all people, settling down with a husband." "Life is full of surprises," Joe replied mildly. "Indeed it is," agreed Martha, her gaze shifting assessingly to Ethan. "Though I must admit you could have done worse, Josephine. At least he appears to know his way around a ranch." Coming from Martha, this was high praise indeed. Joe bit back a laugh. "Thank you, Mrs. Willoughby. We think so too." As they continued toward the church, Joe noticed the changed way people regarded them. The whispers and sidelong glances that had followed her for years had transformed into smiles and nods of approval. It was as if her decision to marry had suddenly made her acceptable in the eyes of Shoshone City's residents. "Remarkable what a difference an engagement ring makes," she observed to Ethan as they approached the church. "Suddenly, I'm respectable." Ethan squeezed her hand. "You were always respectable, Joe. They just didn't have the sense to see it." The minister, a kindly older man named Reverend Thompson, welcomed them warmly and agreed to perform the ceremony at the Taylor Ranch rather than in the church. "James should not have to travel in his condition," the Reverend said understandingly. "And a home wedding has a charm all its own." With the date set and the minister secured, Joe and Ethan visited the general store to order supplies for the wedding feast. Mrs. Henderson was effusive in her congratulations. "I knew from the moment I saw you two together," she declared, clapping her hands in delight. "Such a handsome couple, and so right for each other." Joe exchanged an amused glance with Ethan, both recalling their first meeting in the Elkhorn Saloon. Mrs. Henderson's revisionist history was kind. if not entirely accurate. As they were completing their purchases, the store's door opened and Victor Holloway entered. The atmosphere in the store immediately tensed as he spotted Joe and Ethan. "Miss Taylor," he acknowledged stiffly. "Mr. Finch. I hear congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," Joe replied cautiously, surprised by his civil tone. Holloway's expression remained hard, but there was a hint of grudging respect in his eyes. "You outplayed me with the cattle sale," he admitted. "Not many could have managed that in your situation." Joe inclined her head slightly, accepting the backhanded compliment. "Business is business, Mr. Holloway." "Indeed it is," he agreed. "And speaking of business, I've been thinking that perhaps a more cooperative approach might benefit us both in the future." Joe raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in her expression. "What did you have in mind?" "Water rights," Holloway replied. "My eastern pastures have plenty. Your western ones are dry. Perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement for a fair price, of course." It was an olive branch of sorts, though Joe suspected it was prompted more by Holloway's recognition that she was a formidable adversary than by any genuine desire for neighborly relations. Still, water rights would be invaluable for the ranch's future. "We'd be willing to discuss it," she said after a moment's consideration. "Perhaps after the wedding." Holloway nodded curtly. "After the wedding, then. Good day to you both." As he moved to another part of the store, Ethan gave Joe an impressed look. "You handled that well." "Water rights would make a significant difference for the ranch," Joe explained. "And if Holloway is willing to be reasonable for once, we'd be foolish not to consider it." Ethan smiled, a mixture of pride and admiration in his eyes. "Mrs. Finch, I believe you're going to be a formidable rancher for many years to come." The sound of her future name on his lips sent a thrill through Joe. "Mrs. Finch," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." The next 11 days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Joe, with help from Mrs. Gunderson and several other neighbor women, cleaned the ranch house from top to bottom, baked pies and cakes, and prepared for what was shaping up to be the most significant social event in Shoshone City that autumn. Ethan, meanwhile, worked with a team of men from town to repair the barn and corral fencing, creating a suitable space for the wedding celebration. James Taylor supervised from his chair on the porch, his strength returning a little more each day. On the day before the wedding, Joe stood in her bedroom, looking at the dress laid out on her bed. It had been her mother's, a simple but elegant ivory gown with lace trim that Mrs. Gunderson had helped alter to fit Joe's taller frame. Beside it lay the locket she had once considered selling to hire help for the ranch. Now it would serve its intended purpose, a memory of her mother on Joe's wedding day. A knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Gunderson with more wedding details to discuss. Instead, it was her father who entered, walking with a cane but upright and steadier than she had seen him in months. "Pa," she said in surprise, "you shouldn't be exerting yourself climbing the stairs." James waved off her concern. "I wasn't about to miss seeing my daughter the day before her wedding." He moved to stand beside her, his gaze falling on the dress. "Your mother would be so proud to see you wearing this tomorrow." "I wish she were here," Joe said softly. James put an arm around her shoulders. "She is in her way. In the locket she left you, in the strength she passed on to you, in the way you hold your chin up when faced with a challenge." He paused, his eyes growing misty. "She always said you'd find your own path, even when others doubted. And look at you now, saving the ranch, finding a partner worthy of you, proving all those naysayers wrong." Joe leaned her head against her father's shoulder, blinking back tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Pa." Everything I know about running the ranch, about standing my ground, I learned from you." "You give me too much credit," James replied. "You've got your mother's spirit and determination. I just gave you the practical skills to go with it." He straightened, reaching into his pocket. "Which reminds me, I have something for you." He pulled out a small leather pouch and placed it in Joe's hand. Inside was a pair of earrings, delicate gold drops with small pearls that matched the ring Ethan had given her. "They were your grandmother's," James explained. "I've been saving them for your wedding day." Joe carefully removed the earrings, holding them up to catch the light. "They're beautiful, Pa, thank you." "They'll look perfect with your mother's dress and locket," James said with satisfaction. "Now, if you don't mind helping your old father back downstairs. I believe your groom is returning from town with the last of the supplies for tomorrow." Together, they made their way downstairs just as Ethan's wagon pulled up outside. Joe felt her heart lift at the sight of him, still slightly amazed that this man, this kind, strong, capable man, had chosen her, just as she had chosen him. Ethan jumped down from the wagon, his face lighting up when he saw Joe on the porch. "There's my bride," he called, striding toward her with long, purposeful steps. "Missing me already?" "Terribly," Joe replied with a laugh. "It's been at least 3 hours since breakfast." Ethan bounded up the porch steps to plant a quick kiss on her lips, mindful of James's presence. "Well, I come bearing gifts to make up for my absence. The cake Mrs. Henderson promised, a barrel of cider from the Johnsons," and he reached into his pocket with a flourish. "A letter from my sister in Texas. She sends her congratulations and hopes to visit in the spring." Joe accepted the letter with surprise. "You wrote to your family about me?" "Of course," Ethan replied. "I told them I'd found the woman I want to spend my life with, and that we're building something special here. Sarah, that's my youngest sister, wrote back immediately. The others will take longer, I expect, especially my father." There was a hint of old pain in his voice at the mention of his father, but it was overshadowed by the genuine joy in his expression. Joe understood then that in choosing to stay with her, in putting down roots at the Taylor ranch, Ethan had begun the process of reconciliation with his past. It might take time, but he was no longer running from it. "I can't wait to meet them," Joe said sincerely. "All of them when they're ready." Ethan's smile deepened, his eyes full of love. "Thank you for that. Now, should we unload these supplies before Mrs. Gunderson arrives and scolds us for dawdling?" The day of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with just enough autumn chill in the air to make the afternoon celebration comfortable. The ranch had been transformed, the yard swept clean, lanterns hanging from the trees, tables set up for the feast, and flowers decorating the porch where Reverend Thompson would perform the ceremony. Joe stood in her bedroom, allowing Mrs. Gunderson to help her into her mother's dress. The older woman worked in silence, her gnarled fingers deftly fastening buttons and adjusting the fall of fabric until everything was perfect. "There," Mrs. Gunderson said finally, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful, child. A proper bride." Joe turned to the small mirror on her dresser, barely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The ivory dress complemented her honey blonde hair, which Mrs. Gunderson had arranged in soft waves with a few wildflowers woven through it. The gold locket rested at the hollow of her throat, and her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the light when she moved. "Thank you," Joe said softly, "for everything." Mrs. Gunderson patted her cheek affectionately. "You deserve every happiness, Josephine. You've worked so hard, carried so much on your young shoulders. It does my heart good to see you finding joy." A knock at the door announced the arrival of her father, dressed in his best suit and standing straighter than Joe had seen in months. "It's time, Josephine," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he took in the sight of his daughter. Ethan's waiting, and so are half the people in Shoshone City, if I'm not mistaken. Joe took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. How do I look, Pa? Like a vision, James replied without hesitation. The most beautiful bride these Idaho hills have ever seen. He offered his arm, and Joe took it, drawing strength from his steady presence as they made their way downstairs and to the front door. Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as guests gathered on the porch and in the yard. "Ready?" James asked, pausing with his hand on the doorknob. Joe nodded, her heart full to bursting. "Ready." The door opened to reveal a scene more perfect than Joe could have imagined. Lanterns glowed in the afternoon light, casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. At the far end of the porch stood Reverend Thompson, his Bible open in his hands. And beside him stood Ethan, looking more handsome than Joe had ever seen him in a new suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his gray eyes finding hers immediately across the distance that separated them. A hush fell over the gathering as Joe and her father stepped outside. Someone began to play a fiddle, a sweet, simple melody that filled the air as they walked slowly toward where Ethan waited. Joe was dimly aware of familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson beaming proudly, Martha Willoughby dabbing at her eyes despite her earlier skepticism, even Victor Holloway standing at the back with a grudgingly respectful expression. But Joe had eyes only for Ethan, whose gaze never left hers as she approached. When she reached his side and her father placed her hand in his, the sense of rightness was overwhelming. This was where she belonged with this man in this place, building a future together. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Ethan and Joe exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the seasons of life. When Ethan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger to join his grandmother's pearl ring, his hands were steady but his eyes were suspiciously bright. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Thompson concluded with a broad smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride." Ethan needed no further encouragement. His arms encircled Joe as he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of all they had overcome and all they had to look forward to. When they broke apart, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. "May I present Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Finch," the Reverend announced, his voice carrying over the celebration. The rest of the day passed in a blur of congratulations, feasting, music, and dancing. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the ranch, Joe found herself standing beside Martha Willoughby at the refreshment table. "Well, Josephine," Martha said with uncharacteristic warmth, "it seems I was wrong about you. They said you'd never find a husband, but here you are married before sunset, just as the day is ending." Joe smiled, her gaze finding Ethan across the yard where he was sharing a laugh with her father. "It's not an ending, Mrs. Willoughby. It's very much a beginning." Martha considered this, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right, and a fine beginning it is." She patted Joe's hand in an almost motherly gesture. "Your cowboy is a good man. You hold on to him." "I intend to," Joe replied, surprised but touched by the older woman's approval. As the celebration continued into the evening, lanterns glowing like earthbound stars against the darkening sky, Ethan found his way back to Joe's side. His arms slipped around her waist as they stood together, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Finch?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happier than I ever thought possible, Mr. Finch," Joe replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" "I'm standing here with the most beautiful, courageous woman I've ever known, who just happened to agree to be my wife," Ethan said, his voice warm with emotion. "This ranch may have been struggling when I arrived, but I'd say it's the richest land in Idaho tonight." Jo turned in his arms to face him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light and something deeper, a love and contentment that filled her entire being. Who would have thought that hiring a drifting cowboy would lead to this? "I did," came James Taylor's voice as he joined them, leaning more heavily on his cane after the long day but looking happier than Jo had seen him in years. "The moment I saw him looking at you like you hung the moon and stars, I knew. Some things are just meant to be." As night fell fully over the Taylor Finch ranch, most of the guests began to depart, calling final congratulations and well wishes. James retired to the house, leaving the newlyweds to say goodbye to the last of their friends. Finally, they were alone, standing together on the porch where they had been married just hours before. "So," Ethan said, taking both of Jo's hands in his. "What now, wife?" Jo smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Now we build our life together, husband. Day by day, season by season. Starting tonight," Ethan suggested, a mischievous glint in his eye as he swept her into his arms. Jo laughed as he carried her toward the house, toward their future. "Starting tonight," she agreed. In the years that followed, the Taylor Finch Ranch would face its share of challenges: harsh winters, economic downturns, and yes, more droughts. But it would also know abundant harvests, the patter of children's feet, and the deep, abiding love of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were settled, Jo and Ethan would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Idaho sky in hues of gold and pink. In those quiet moments, they would remember that first cattle drive, the desperate gamble that had saved the ranch, and the love that had blossomed against all odds. They would remember, too, the whispers and doubts that had once followed Jo through Shoshone City, the predictions that she would never find a husband, never be happy, never succeed. And they would share a smile, knowing that sometimes the best answer to those who say never is simply to prove them wrong before sunset and every day thereafter.